Morning, again. I'm on chapter 4, which is pretty short, so I'll probably move right on to chapter 5. Okay? Chapter 4, Sign of the Beaver. Alright, so we just finished with Ben, that stranger guy that came, and he stole his rifle, so now he's not going to have anything to hunt with. Chapter 4. It was hard to be deprived of the hunting. Now, whenever we went to the forest, the squirrels and the rabbits frisked about boldly, knowing perfectly well he had no gun in his hands. Once, he was certain he could have had a good shot at a deer. Instead, he went fishing, and he knew he ought to be grateful that the creek and the pond could provide all the food he needed, even though fish didn't seem to stick to his ribs like a good meat stew. Here and there in a sunny spot, he discovered a patch of blueberries. Gradually, his spirits rose again. The July weather was perfect. The flies and mosquitoes were less bothersome. He began to count the days ahead instead of the days he had notched. 2 or 3 more sticks and his family would be there. Would be here. The corn was growing taller. The little hard green pumpkins were rounding out. He could wait a little longer. Perhaps he even became a mite careless. He had been fishing all one morning. A good clear day, the water still nippy on his ankles, the sun warm on his bare head. He had followed the creek a long way and had a lucky catch. He came whistling out of the woods, swinging 4 speckled trout. He quieted down of a sudden when he heard a crackling in the underbrush close by, and then he stopped short at the side of the cabin. The door was swinging open at a crazy angle, one hinge broken. Across the door sill, some white stuff dribbled like spilled flour. With a shout, he dropped the fish and ran. It was flour. Tracked all over the cabin floor, the sack ripped open and dragged across the room. The cabin was a shambles. The stools overturned, the shelf swept bare, the precious molasses keg upside down on the floor and empty. Ben must have come back. For a moment, hot sparks of anger drove every sensible thought out of his head. And then he knew it couldn't have been Ben. Ben was too fond of food to waste it. Indians? No, it wasn't possible any human being would scatter food like this. And with a sinking heart, he realized what had happened. He remembered the thrashing in the underbrush. It had to be a bear. Somehow he had neglected to bar the door securely. Well, the damage was done, and the bear would be half a mile away by now. Helpless with fury at his own carelessness, he stood for some time in the middle of the cabin, unable to pull his wits together. Then he went down on his hands and knees and carefully began to scrape up the traces of flour. After a time, he gave up. The best he had managed to salvage was 2 handfuls of gritty, unappetizing meal, even though he took the good pewter spoon and dug into the hollows of the dirt floor. Blech. After a long time, he felt hungry enough to remember the fish. Oh, yeah. Half-heartedly, he cleaned them and blew up the fire and roasted them. He found a few grains of salt left in the tin to sprinkle on them. He would have to make the best of it. He wouldn't starve as long as he had a fish line, but tomorrow he would not even have salt. Wasn't careful. All right, on to chapter 5. Day after day, he kept remembering the bee tree. He and his father had discovered it weeks ago. High in a tree at the swampy edge of the pond they had called Loon Pond, the bees were buzzing in and out of an old woodpecker hole. Matt had thought they were wild bees, but his father said no. There were no bees at all in America till the colonists brought them from England. Is that true? We should research that. This swarm must have escaped from one of the river towns. Bees were better left alone, Pa said. He felt he could scarcely endure another meal of plain fish. He was hungry for a bit of something tasty. Knowing so well his fondness for molasses, his mother had persuaded them to carry that little keg all the way to Maine when his father would rather have gone without. She would have smiled to see him running his finger around and around the empty keg like a child and looking off the last drop that the bear had missed. Now he couldn't stop thinking about the honey. It would be worth a sting or 2 just to get a taste of it. There couldn't be much danger in going up that tree and taking just a little. A cupful, perhaps, that the bees would never miss. One morning, he made up his mind to try it, come what might. It It was an easy tree to climb, with branches as neatly placed as the rungs of a ladder. The beast did not seem to notice as he pulled himself higher and higher. Even when his head was on level with the hole, they flew lazily in and out, not paying him any mind. The hole was small, not big enough for his hand, and the spoon he had brought with him. Peering in, he could just glimpse far inside the golden mass of honeycomb. The bark all around the hole was rotting and crumbling. Cautiously, he put his fingers on the edge and gave a slight tug. A good-sized piece of bark broke off in his hand, and with it came the bees. With a furious buzzing, they came pouring from that broken hole. The humming grew to a roar like a giant wind. Matt felt a sharp pain on his neck, and then another, and another. The angry creatures swarmed along his hands and bare arms, in his hair, on his face. How he got down off that tree, he never remembered. Water! If he could reach water, he could escape them. Bellowing and waving his arms, he plunged towards the pond. The bees were all around him. He could not see through the whirling cloud of them. The boggy ground sucked at his feet. He pulled one foot clear out of his boot, went stumbling over sharp rocks to the water's edge, and flung himself forward. His foot caught in a fallen branch, and he wrenched it clear. Dazed with pain, he sank down into the icy shelter of the water. He came up choking. Just above the water, the angry bees circled. Twice more he ducked his head and held it down till his lungs were bursting. Oh. He tried to swim out into the pond, but his feet were tangled in dragging weeds. When he tried to jerk them free, a fierce pain ran up his leg and he went under again, thrashing his arms wildly. Then something lifted him. His head came up from the water, and he gulped air into his aching lungs. He felt strong arms around him. Half conscious, he dreamed that his father was carrying him, and he did not wonder how this could be. Presently, he knew he was lying on dry ground. Though his eyelids were swollen almost shut, he could see two figures bending over him. Unreal, half-naked figures with dark faces. Then, as his wits began to return to him, he saw that they were Indians, an old man and a boy. The man's hands were reaching for his throat, and in panic, Matt tried to jerk away. "Not move," a deep voice ordered. "Bee needles have poison. Must get out." Matt was too weak to struggle. He could not even lift his head. Now that he was out of the cold water, his skin seemed to be on fire from head to toe. Yet he could not stop shivering. He had to lie helplessly while the man's hands moved over his face and neck and body. Gradually, he realized that they were gentle hands, probing and rubbing at one tender spot after another, and his panic began to die away. He could not think clearly. Things seemed to keep fading before he could quite grasp them. He could not protest when the man lifted him again and carried him like a baby. It did not seem to matter where they were taking him. But shortly he found himself lying on his own bed in his own cabin. He was alone. The Indians had gone. He lay, too tired and sore to figure out how he came to be here, knowing only that the nightmare of whirling bees and choking water was past, and that he was safe. Some time passed, and once again, the Indian was bending over him, holding a wooden spoon against his lips. He swallowed in spite of himself, even when he found it was not food, but some bitter medicine. He was left alone again, and presently he slept. All right, that's the end of chapter 4 and 5. Next 6.